everyone. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who do not know who I am, my name is Clemente Diaz. I'm the Associate Director of College Now here at Baruch College. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, Dr. Keaton Fletcher, who is an Assistant Professor of Industrial Organizational Psychology at Georgia Tech. For those of you who don't know what IO psychology is, it's basically the psychology of the workplace. And apart from that, he also has a expertise in occupational health psychology, which is what today's presentation is. And then lastly, apart from being an assistant professor at Georgia Tech, he's also the host of the Healthy Work podcast, which I'm sure he'll talk a little bit more about. But without further ado, I want to turn it over to Dr. Fletcher so he can talk to you about occupational health psychology.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen. You would think a year and something into this, I would be better at getting this going. Excellent. Can you see my screen? Okay, perfect. All right, yeah, thanks for that awesome introduction. I'm excited to talk to you about occupational health psychology. As Clemente mentioned, I'm an industrial organizational psychologist. My research is primarily on leadership in the workplace, and inherently tied to that is teams and teamwork. It's really hard to have a leader without a team. And then supplementing that with training. A large part of my research focuses on developing leaders and developing teams. And so the science of training and how to do that well. I'm sure that you've all been in some sort of experience that's training like that you just feel like you didn't get a whole lot out of. And it's because of not following the science of training. And that's part of what I do. And then, as Clemente mentioned, I specialize in occupational health psychology. So whereas industrial organizational psychology focuses largely on work and the worker, largely focusing on improving performance and helping improve organizational outcomes. Occupational health psychology comes in and says, we need to focus on the worker too, and look at how work impacts people's health. And I think that, morally and ethically, all IO psychologists should be at least a little bit of occupational health psychologists and recognize that work does impact your health in some very clear and serious ways, in both good and bad ways as well. And it's just exciting to be part of that field of research. Before we spend the next hour together, just a brief overview of who I am as well. I'm also a new father. Part of work is recognizing how work integrates with family. And so I also like to mention that we're more than just our jobs. So I'm a new father, and I'm also married to an IO psychologist and an occupational health psychologist, Dr. Kimberly French. She's also an assistant professor at Georgia Tech with me. And so that's always fun to mention as well. We have a lot of conversations about research, and so it's always top of mind. As I mentioned, I study leadership and occupational health and how those intersect, looking at health outcomes of leaders. I'm sure that some of you have had supervisors or teachers maybe that have ruined your day, and you ruminate about it, you think about it after school or after work, and it just sticks with you. And so recognizing that your leader or your boss, your supervisor, can directly impact your health is one of my areas of research. Another one is also looking at leaders' own health outcomes. We know that leaders are people too, and we should care about how work impacts their health as well. And then lastly, kind of flipping the script and looking at how your health and physiological mechanisms impact your performance as a leader and impact whether you become a leader. So right now, for example, I have this study that I think is really cool, looking at how testosterone, which I'm pretty sure we're all familiar with as a hormone, and cortisol, which is another hormone that you make in response to stress in particular, but it naturally fluctuates throughout the day and people have different levels. So looking at how those interact together to predict whether or not you speak up in a group and become a leader in a context where there's no formal leadership mechanism. And I don't know, I think that's pretty exciting, looking at how health can impact how you become a leader. But as Clemente mentioned, the whole point of today's lecture is broader and looking at occupational health psychology as a field in general. And so this is going to be a really broad overview Trying to squeeze a whole field into an hour, including time for questions, is challenging. So hopefully just view this as like a little tasting, a little sampling platter of some of the research that's out there and a potential career field for you. One in psychology that I think people aren't aware of usually. I certainly wasn't. I went to a small liberal arts school. We didn't have a class on IO psychology, let alone occupational health psychology. And so I discovered IO psychology my senior year after I realized I didn't actually want to go to medical school. And I was a neuroscience and psychology major, switched career fields, applied to IO psychology graduate programs. And then in there is when I found OHP. And now it's a major part of my research. And so I'm really excited to be able to bring some of it to you now and get that early exposure to, I think, a pretty cool career field. So what is OHP? It concerns the application of psychology to improving the quality of work life and protecting and promoting the safety, health, and well-being of workers. And you're going to see across a couple of different definitions of this field that safety, health, and well-being are sort of the three key dimensions, right, of occupational health psychology. There's the safety bucket, looking at how things like accidents or injuries can occur in the workplace, health and stress, looking at sort of the psychological component of this and how it can have an ultimate impact on your physical health, and then well-being, which is also looking at sort of the broader outcomes and the potential benefits of work. Largely, when we talk about the protecting side, we're looking at organizational interventions. So what can we do from the organizational side to reduce hazards, to make the workplace less stressful? How can we redesign jobs? So rather than giving you 30 different tasks that kind of fall into three different buckets of things, maybe we only give you 20 tasks that fall into one bucket. Or rather than saying, go use this machine to do this job, have fun, we put you through a training beforehand and maybe give you some clear manuals on how to use it, as an example. On the other side, there's this promotion component, which is focused on the workers themselves, because you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force them to drink. Same thing with safety and health and things along those lines. We can have all the organizational policies and practices we want, but if people don't care about their own safety and health and well-being, you can't necessarily make them follow those. And so there's some research certainly on the individual side of things of health and safety, which feels shockingly relevant. I think there are some very clear examples of this in our current society, right? Like if you take masking, for example, or taking the vaccine, you can have policies and procedures in place to make getting the vaccine or wearing masks easy and accessible. But then there's also the promotion side of making sure that people feel comfortable and are motivated to do it, and you'll still have some holdouts. And so we can talk about that broader in the context of workplace components. Another really cool part about occupational health psychology that I wanted to highlight from this definition is that it tends to be very interdisciplinary. So certainly OHP involves IO psychologists, sorry, lots of acronyms. Occupational health psychology involves industrial organizational psychologists, but we can bring in occupational medicine, right? So people, doctors and nurses who are specifically focused on workplace injury and health. We can bring in occupational engineering or environmental engineering, environmental medicine, focusing on how literally the physical workplace is designed, because things like HVAC or noise and heat, small spaces, these are all workplace risk factors that impact, again, safety, health, and well-being. Perfect. Okay, and so just to give you a very brief sampling of some of the current science. So as of today, July, what is it, 26th, 2021, these are just a sampling of the peer-reviewed research that's available in the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology preprints. So these are the most recent, hot off the press. They're not even in the physical journal yet. They're just online. What is it that people are working on? And you can see things ranging from workplace bullying to daily well-being, burnout and depression. I'm sure people that's top of mind right now. Burnout has made it sort of into the public consciousness. Self-compassion, so getting to that wellness side, and then definitely stress, retaliation from abusive supervision. And then obviously there's been a lot of research on COVID, the coronavirus lockdowns, things along those lines. And so you can see there's a broad range of research. So anything that touches the workplace and sort of health, well-being, or safety falls under that umbrella of occupational health psychology, as long as we're also looking at, to an extent, the psychology of it, so how it interacts with the person. So a brief history lesson in occupational health psychology before we go forward. It's a relatively new field, but it's also not, which is, I think, one of those fun dynamics. It's not that new that we've realized that your workplace can impact your health. Back in 1845, there was a publication that linked the health problems of the working class in England to the social and physical environment, including the workplace. And so over, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, I guess, people were still were recognizing that your work can impact your health. That idea appears through a range of different publications over the following 100 years. In the 40s, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm sure that you're familiar with that. Again, it's something that's made its way into pop culture, has been tied to work, recognizing that people who have reached self-actualization are better workers, or people who aren't worried about their basic needs are more productive at work, and that work is also a way to meet those needs. As an IO psychologist, I do have to put in a caveat that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is not empirically supported, in that you don't need to meet your basic needs to move forward. You can be, trying to put food on your plate and also searching for meaning in your life at the same time. Those things can co-occur. Wanted to get that out there while it's top of mind. Then we have in 1951 this really cool study that looked at miners. And so, obviously mining is a risky workplace setting, particularly in the 50s. There are very clear health outcomes, something like black lung or injury in the workplace, right, with mines collapsing or even just working with the machinery. And one study, rather than looking at direct health implications or health interventions, it looked at changing the job. So giving miners autonomy over their decisions and having them participate in decision making in the workplace, and found that it actually reduced injuries and improved their health in the long run, which is pretty cool. And then in the 70s, 1970, we have the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, which is under the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. And then 1971, OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, was founded. So clearly a government push for recognizing the need to link the workplace to employee health. Kind of shocking that it took 120 years from that publication in the working class in England to make its way into government regulation. But we got there. And then in 2005, SOHP, the Society for Occupational Health Psychology, was founded. And has just been growing ever since. You can go to their website if you're interested, and there's a lot of really cool resources there, and I have a link to it at the end of this presentation. So why OHP? Why should anyone care? I think, like, intrinsically you should care. We all care about our health, and most of us are going to work at some point in our lives, but we need to sell it a little bit more than that. So we know that work is second only to money in terms of contribution to stress. So when you ask people what's stressing you out the most in your life, usually it's finances number one, and then my work number two. And so we need to address that major issue. And then we know that healthy workers are productive workers, right? Going back to that mining study, or the slew of studies in OHP that showed the exact same thing. And I think this past year and a half also kind of made that clear, right? When you're calling out sick because you have COVID for 2 weeks, that's 2 weeks of you not being able to do your job. Or if you have to quarantine your whole workplace because all of your workers are sick, now you've also affected the supply chain. And so if anything, I think the last year and a half has shown how important occupational health and occupational health psychology are, not just for workers themselves, but for the workplace and ultimately supply chains and the economy at large. Some interventions are associated with bottom line savings for organizations, not necessarily in the short run, right? Any sort of intervention is going to cost money in the short run, but when you look at the money you're saving from workman's comp, payments and insurance payments, to absenteeism, so people not coming to work, or presenteeism, coming to work when they're sick and spreading that illness both to your colleagues and potentially also customers. Some interventions are ultimately cost saving for companies, which helps them sell it to their shareholders. And then ultimately, we know employee turnover, so people quitting their jobs and leaving the organization for other jobs or no jobs are costly to the company. So, and one of the reasons that people leave is because of their health. It's one of the number one reasons for early retirement, for disability based unemployment. And then also for people wanting to leave their jobs is that they feel like their health is being affected by their work. So we care about occupational health psychology. Hopefully I've convinced you, and hopefully you can convince employers in the future, even if you don't become an OHP person. So now that you've had like a really brief overview of the field, I just want to go into some of the topics that we cover, starting with safety, moving into stress, and then just touching very briefly at the end, because I think we're going to be running out of time because I'm very easily excited about this. Wellness. So what does it mean to be safe at work, right? Certainly there's this avoiding unnecessary risks. So you can have the option of doing things fast or doing things right and safe, right? So oftentimes our safety behaviors take more time and take more effort, but cutting corners is inherently unsafe, right? And so being safe at work means not cutting corners, doing things the right and the safe way, making sure that you're being safe in that respect. Handling materials safely, right? There's a wide range of materials that can harm you, whether they're carcinogens, so they can cause cancer, or maybe they are very hot or very cold or something else, right? Infectious diseases that you might be handling. So you want to make sure that you're handling materials safely. And then using personal protective equipment and then other safety equipment. So related like workplace equipment to even something like the wet signs that you put up on the floor, that would be safety equipment that employees can choose to not use, but we hope that they won't, right? And again, like we've seen with wearing masks, this is a choice. People have to choose to do this, and you can make it available, you can make it easy, but you also have to motivate them to do it. So what does it mean to be safe at work? Hopefully that's some examples. So why are people safe or not safe at work? One of the most frequently used models. So in psychology, we use models all the time to try to explain ultimately people's behavior, right? What is it that goes into people's behavior? And we can sort of draw, we love these box and arrows or bubble and arrow models of X leads to Y leads to Z, and Z is this behavior that we care about. And basically, we're just trying to make sense of the black box that is your mind. And there's some intersection recently with neuroscience and physiology, where we're not just talking about your mind and your psychological experience, but also your physiological experience, looking at your brain, looking at hormones, things along those lines. But most of our models are at the psychological construct level, so thinking about the experience. So we have safety climate. This is essentially, do you feel like in your workplace, everyone values safety, right? So you can imagine there are certain workplaces that put an emphasis on safety. Think of like Panera, I think is a really fun example where if you're sitting in Panera, you'll often hear someone shout like hot bread, and like everyone there will also shout hot bread. One, to like sell the fact that they have fresh bread, but also to like let their coworkers know that someone's carrying something very hot. They're handling an unsafe material, and they don't want to bring their coworkers. And so that would be high safety climate. Whereas you could imagine some other workplace where people haphazardly wear personal protective equipment. Maybe that's even frowned upon because it's not the cool thing to do. And so that'd be low in safety climate. And there are sort of two things that go into it. There's the management values. So from top down, is the organization valuing safety? Are they promoting it? And then also from the individual level and the coworker level, some of the things that we talked about go into safety climate. Then if you're working in a place that's high in safety climate, ideally that's going to lead to safety knowledge. Maybe there's some things that you just don't know are unsafe, or you don't know how to properly wear an N95 mask, or you don't know how to properly handle hot bread at Panera, or you're not motivated, right? And so more proximal, closer predictors to these outcomes are knowledge, skills, and motivation. all of which are directly impacted by that safety climate. And then ultimately, what is your safety task performance? We can literally quantify your performance on safety behaviors, right? Are you shouting hot bread every time you see hot bread? Are you wearing your N95 mask appropriately, correctly, or are there errors in how you're wearing it? And then safety contextual performance, which is not necessarily your safety performance, but maybe you helping other people be safe. So you've got your mask on, now you're helping other people wear it and encouraging them to wear it. It's a balance between production and safety. As I've mentioned, oftentimes safety requires more effort and time, and that's effort and time that's going to something that doesn't directly affect the bottom line, certainly not in the immediate run. And so you have to overcome skepticism amongst both employers as well as employees. You have to help them believe that safety is important, that accidents are preventable, and that personal protective equipment works. Again, I think we've seen really clear examples of this in the last year. Interestingly, gender kind of intersects with safety. Men are most of the workplace fatalities, even though they make up only about half of the workforce. Part of this is men tend to be in like riskier workplaces, things like mining or construction, but also men tend to make riskier choices and they're less likely to adhere to safety guidelines and principles. And there's some work that suggests that it's sort of a perceived masculinity component to it. But that's a question that you could further study in occupational health psychology, which is fun. Then personality. I think we're all familiar with the notion of personality and personality assessments. There's a cool, pretty empirically supported theory of human personality. Says you have 5 dimensions of personality: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, which is basically you're focusing on getting things done and doing them right, doing them well. Neuroticism, which is sort of how emotionally volatile you are. Are you withdrawn? Do you have mood swings? Are you nervous, anxious? And then openness to experience. And we see of those 5, agreeableness and conscientiousness are particularly important for safety, right? Agreeable people tend to also be rule followers, and conscientious people recognize the importance of safety. So people who are high in those tend to be high in safety. So imagine if you're an employer, you'd want to hire people who are high in agreeableness and conscientiousness if you have a particularly unsafe work environment, because they'll go that extra mile to be safe. So that's, like I said, a brief smattering of safety. Kind of shifting gears now into stress. Um, Stress is really interesting, and we talk about it all the time, and that makes researching it really fun. But it also means that there is some technical jargon, but it can, I think, help pop culture talk about stress too. Because imagine you can say, "I'm stressed. This is stressful. I feel stress," right? And in psychology, we like our definitions and we like things to be very clear. So we have a stressor, which is the thing that's causing you stress. We have strain, which is the stressful outcome. So that'd be something like distress, feeling stressed out. And then overall, the whole thing is the stress process. And one of the really popular models that I really appreciate is this model by Merson and Erickson. It says you have the stressor, it's processed by your brain, or your psychology, your mind, and then you engage in the stress response. And that stress response is both psychological and physiological. So you're cognitively, mentally doing something to deal with that stressor, but your body's also responding to that stressor, as I mentioned earlier, releasing cortisol, also releasing a variety of other neurotransmitters and hormones to deal with it. And then depending on how that interaction with the stressor works, you can either train or strain. And so I think one of the clearest examples is just working out. So imagine you're bench pressing weights, right? And your body, that's a load, that's a stressor that you put on your body. Your body is now responding to that by mobilizing resources to your chest to deal with that weight that you're now putting on top of it. And if you are pushing yourself, but you're able to do it safely and successfully, you've now trained your body and you're going to be able to bench press more the next time. But maybe you did it unsafely, you mobilized resources improperly or not successfully, or you just didn't have enough resources to do it. Someone put 300 pounds on that bar and you still tried to bench press it. And now you've potentially experienced strain, and this is a range of outcomes. You might feel bad about yourself that you couldn't do it. You might literally have pulled a muscle or strained a muscle. Hopefully that's as bad as that was, you had a spotter. But I think that is a really clear example. And it's not just bench pressing and physical weight, but we can think about the same things with psychological stressors. So imagine a really stressful test that you have in one of your classes, and you mobilize resources to study for that test. You then take the test, and maybe you end up doing really well, and you feel like you learned something, and you gain self-efficacy, and now you've trained. Or you feel like you totally bombed it despite putting in all this effort. You don't feel like you learned anything, and now it's just strain, right? And you're experiencing a decrease in self-efficacy, things along those lines. And so all the same things apply to stressors at work. How do we measure stress in the stressful experience? I think this is really cool because it's a really dynamic experience. We can get physiological measures, things like heart rate or heart rate variability. So your heart doesn't beat at exactly the same point from moment to moment. There's variability in how much it beats. But typically when you're stressed out, it tends to beat more regularly. We can measure sweating, so like even micro sweating on your hands, blood pressure, right? The more stressed out you are, the higher your blood pressure is. Stress hormones like cortisol. What's really interesting though is that if we just look at the physiological measures, this looks just like physiological arousal, right? That so maybe it's stressful, or maybe it's just being awake or aroused of some sort, right? There's something interesting going on in your life, and so there's a piece missing from just the physiological measurement. We also need the psychological experience. And so that's where we get self-report. And people can rate how stressful particular experiences are. They can rate, maybe they've had objectively stressful experiences, like having a family member die, or graduating high school, applying to colleges. Some of these events have been ranked as major life events that have sort of a point value of how stressful they are. Or maybe they've experienced a certain number of daily hassles, something like commuting traffic, or getting into an argument with a colleague, or maybe just things in their life don't feel controllable or manageable. And so there's a range of different other self-report components to that psychological experience of stress that we can also capture. And figuring out how to best measure those is also part of occupational health psychology. Another component of occupational health psychology that's worth talking about now when we're talking about measuring is what kind of stressors or stressful experiences are you trying to measure? Are we talking about chronic stress or acute stress? So acute stress, you are focused on just the immediate exposure and outcomes. And so it's a short period of exposure, maybe seconds to days, and the outcomes tend to be relatively short-lived, though that isn't necessarily always true, depending on how intense that experience was, right? So we could talk about a violent workplace episode. I think we've seen a lot of videos recently going around of flight attendants being, assaulted by passengers. I think that's a really good example. That's a very short exposure episode. It lasts maybe a couple of minutes, up to an hour if you're stuck in the middle of the air for it. And it's over, but the outcomes might be very long lived, right? So you might have post-traumatic stress disorder, but you also have short-lived outcomes, right? That cortisol experience, the psychological distress might peak very shortly thereafter, things along those lines. Then we have something like slips in response to not wearing your safety shoes, and that can cause either a short-term outcome or long-term outcome again. Or a work-family conflict episode, right? Maybe you had to stay late at work to get a project done, and now you're missing dinner with your family, and that might result in you just having a negative mood when you get home, but you sleep and you're over it. So a whole range of acute stressors. On the other hand, we have chronic stressors, and these are things that you are experiencing over and over again. You're not quite able to separate them from your workplace. These are months or years, right? So maybe we're talking exposure to toxic chemicals. We are talking about different types of physical activities. Maybe part of your job is putting cans on a shelf, you're stocking shelves. And that is a very repetitive motion, and we know repetitive motions tend to lead to musculoskeletal disorders, or even just being a professor and working at a laptop all day. We are in the same position, and over many days, months, years of that position, we get back pain, or other worse outcomes from that, I suppose. Or maybe we're not talking about physical experiences, we're talking about psychological, so chronic workplace bullying, or maybe chronic financial insecurity. Your job isn't paying you well enough, and so that is a long-term stressor. And so these have been associated with things like clinical depression, anxiety, things along those lines as well, but also physical health outcomes. I don't want it to seem like psychological experiences only lead to psychological outcomes. We also know that they can lead to health outcomes, both through reducing your immune functioning. There's a direct link from your psychological stressful experience to how well your immune system is functioning. Maybe you've experienced this after the end of a semester, you get a cold because you had to ramp up, you're stressed during finals, at the end of the semester, getting all of your projects and papers done, your body's immune system just isn't functioning as well. And then once all the stressors are gone, you are now experiencing the symptoms of a cold. Other workplace stressors in particular that we can focus on. Sorry, someone's like power washing outside. Hopefully that's not too loud. There are role stressors. So basically how people design your job. Each job you have is a role. And if it's ambiguously defined, that's stressful. So maybe you've had a project where the instructions weren't super clear, you weren't sure what you needed to do, but you're still going to be evaluated on it. That's stressful. I'm sure you had that experience. You wanted some clarity, you went to the teacher and asked, or maybe you didn't, you just stressed out and thought like, I don't know if I did this the right way. I don't know if I gave you what you wanted. It's the same thing in the workplace. Role conflict. And so maybe you have different hats that you have to wear, and sometimes those hats are competing. So you have to answer to your subordinates, but also your supervisor. And as much as you want to support your subordinates, your supervisor wants you to push them to work faster and harder. And that's conflict and that's stressful. Or role overload. It might just be the case that there's too much on your plate, that your job is too broad, there are too many tasks, and that is also in of itself stressful. There's interpersonal conflict. We know that social interactions are stressful themselves, but there can also be particularly stressful experiences like bullying or mistreatment from coworkers, or uh, clients and customers, violence from coworkers, clients, customers, things along those lines. Organizational constraints. So it might just be that you some sort of design from the workplace again is not giving you the amount of time that you need, the control that you need to do your job, or the money that you need to do your job, or to live your life successfully. We talked about work family or work life conflict. It's not just interfering with your family, it can also be interfering with other components of your life, like going to the gym. But I also don't want to say that it's only dark there. There's potential enhancement too. That people look at that bonus side of how it can work enhance your life and your family experience. Job insecurity. And so again, this is something that we've experienced a lot of in the last year and a half. People not sure, are you going to get fired at any moment now? Are you going to get furloughed? Is this company going to go under? And that is stressful, worrying about whether or not you're going to have a job when you wake up tomorrow. Emotional labor, so having to give service with a smile and be kind to potentially customers who are being rude or violent towards you. Again, we've seen, I think, lots of examples of that, and can visualize that pretty easily. We've talked about physical conditions, a whole range of physical conditions in the workplace, and then work schedules, when you work. So people who work nights, people who work rotating shifts, people who work particularly long shifts, so like 12 to 14-hour shifts or even longer, 24-hour shifts, and then non-standard shifts, anything that's basically outside that 8 to 6 p.m. window, all tend to have worse stress outcome or health outcomes, just because the world is not designed for people who don't work the 8 to 6 p.m. Schedule right now. And then when we look at the outcomes, what can we talk about? Negative affect. So are you in a bad mood? Are you depressed? Are you stressed? Feeling distressed? Musculoskeletal disorders, as we talked about. So things like carpal tunnel syndrome or tendonitis, or back pain. It's the third leading reason for disability or retirement, and it's the leading workplace health complaint. And so we want to know, how can we prevent or reduce musculoskeletal disorders? Cardiovascular disease is frequently researched, but and cancer is as well, though to a lesser extent. Health behaviors, and so there's a recognition that your work impacts your health behavior. So are you eating healthy for you? Are you drinking a lot of alcohol? Are you smoking or using other forms of tobacco? Are you using illicit drugs? things along those lines. Are you getting enough sleep? Are you engaging in proper sleep hygiene? So you're going to bed at the same time every night. You're not working in bed or right before bed. Um, all of those are strains that we can look at as outcomes of the stress process. Again, physical symptoms and then psychological symptoms as well. What's really interesting, and I think also useful, even if you don't ever end up touching occupational health psychology, is this notion of challenge versus threat versus hindrance stressors. So it's essentially recognition that all stressors aren't the same. And this gets back to that strain versus train notion. So challenges are stressful, but you can overcome them, you grow from them, you have the resources to deal with them. And from a physiological standpoint, it elicits a fight response. And so we see that your blood pressure increases, but it increases because your heart is actually pushing out more blood. And in doing so, every beat, it pushes harder, it pushes out more blood. That's how your blood pressure increases. Whereas if you're exposed to a threat, so something that might be taking away your resources, it threatens your self-identity or your safety. Um, it's also stressful. You're not going to gain anything from exposure to it. So this is definitely leading towards strain, but your body physiologically responds to it with the flight response. And so what's really cool about this is that your blood pressure also goes up, but the way it goes up this time, rather than your heart pushing out more blood, it's that your capillaries in your arms and legs squeeze and tighten. So that's where your blood pressure increases, and it pushes the blood into your core. So like this is, imagine, evolutionary psychology. It's if you're being attacked by a bear and the bear like rips off your arm, you're going to lose less blood because we've pushed that blood into your core. Whereas with challenge, you're ready to fight that bear, right? We have to push that blood into your periphery, so you have the muscular strength to deal with that. And then there's this other weird type of stressor, which is a hindrance. It's not quite to that level of threat. It's not threatening your resources necessarily. It's not threatening your self-identity, but you can't gain anything from it. This is like bureaucracy, red tape, dealing with like minor inconveniences, but you still have to deal with them. Also stressful, but less of a clear physiological response, which is also, I think, really interesting. And the reason I bring this up is because I think it's useful to think about stressors rather than all being stressful as what kind of stressor you're exposing yourself to. Is it, or being exposed to? Is it a challenge? Is it a threat? Is it a hindrance? And maybe it's something that you feel like is a threat, but actually it's a challenge, and you can sort of reframe to think about it that way. Sorry, this is a little bit blurry, but it's related. The idea that there's such a thing as too little stress. This is popular right now in psychology and pop psychology as well. That a whole generation has been exposed to too little stress, which is really annoying. Generational science isn't real, but we know that actually there is benefit to stressors, but it has to be the right type of stressor. It has to be challenges, not threats. No one's getting benefit from being exposed to threats or hindrances, but being exposed to challenges, you're training, right? You're learning, growing. But even if you're exposed to challenges only, you can be exposed to too many challenges, and that is in of itself a threat, right? And so that can cause distress. And so there's this notion of eustress, which is the optimal amount of stress that you're exposed to. And the idea is that we can design our jobs to be at that level of optimally stressful, right? So you have the just perfect amount of time pressure, the just perfect amount of things on your plate. Yeah, it's stressful, it's arousing, it keeps you motivated to work, but it's not at the distressing level, right? I think, though, all too often we see things kind of tip over into that distressing level. One model of exposure to stressors that we often use in occupational health psychology is the general adaptation syndrome model by Hans Selye. Basically, if this is in response to a stressor, your body goes into phase one, which is the alarm reaction phase. At first, you are shocked by the introduction of this novel stressor, and so you are less physiologically able and physically able to respond to that stressor. But just for a moment, then your body mobilizes resources, right? We pump out cortisol, we increase our blood pressure, and so you have an increased physiological response. And then you enter phase two, which is that resistance phase, where now you are trying to overcome that stressor. And if it's a challenge, you overcome it, you return back to baseline. and you have now trained, but maybe this is a chronic stressor, or maybe it's a threat and you can't overcome it, but you keep resisting, you keep resisting, you keep resisting, and eventually you just run out of physical and physiological and psychological resources. And so you enter phase three. Um, oh, Okay. You enter, sorry, my computer just gave me a warning note. You enter phase three, which is exhaustion, where you can't resist that stressor anymore. And now you're recruiting resources that you ought not use to fight that to fight that stressor. That's when we start to see negative health outcomes occurring, right? And so again, going back to that bench pressing example, maybe you are really trying to bench press that 300, but you can't. And rather than just isolating your chest muscles, you're also bringing in your back. And now you end up with a severe like back injury from bench pressing, which shouldn't happen, right? And so same idea from psychological stressors. Um, Another really interesting aspect and model that we use is the transactional model of stress. And basically the point of this is that stressors are all largely about how you see them. The same event or the same experience might be really stressful to one person and not at all stressful to someone else. And so this model says that you have a stimulus in the environment, you perceive that stimulus, and then you engage in the primary appraisal. So first, probably non-consciously, your brain says, is this good for me? So is it positive? Might it be giving me resources? Is it irrelevant? So is this just something that's occurring and it's not going to affect me at all? Or is it dangerous? So it's a stressor. Um, and then if it's dangerous, we engage in that secondary appraisal. So do I have enough resources to deal with it? So it's a challenge, or do I have insufficient resources to deal with it? So I'm not gonna be able to overcome this. And then it's a threat, right? And that's when we start to experience distress and other types of strains. And then, we can bring in the coping. How do we deal with these stressors? We can tackle it head on. We can just focus on our emotions and try to make it feel less stressful. And then we can reappraise how we view it. Lots of really cool work going on here as well. Focusing back on the workplace, there's this notion that there needs to be a match between sort of the control you have over your job and the demands that are placed on you. If you have just really high demands but no control, that's going to be a really high strain job, and you're going to be at high risk for physical illness and psychological strains. If you have really low demands, really low control, this is just a passive job. We don't really know much about the outcomes of those passive jobs. These active jobs, though, those high strain or high demands, high control, these are active, they're motivating. So imagine we're like right again in that middle of that eustress. It's that perfect balance of stress and resources to overcome it. Other models explicitly link demands and resources, so those stressors and those resources. And if you have too many demands and not enough resources, you experience different strains, including burnout and ultimately negative health outcomes. The more resources you have, you might experience well-being, so engagement with your job and these positive outcomes, things like performance or life satisfaction. And then I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I recognize we're kind of starting to run short and I do want to leave time for questions. There's an allostatic load model, which brings this whole notion of stressors and exposures to stressors and how you're mobilizing resources and overcoming them to a very physiological level, talking about physiological resources. So again, those immune responses, hormones, etc. And this notion of allostasis, which is sort of balance through adaptation, that we all are familiar with, like homeostasis. You want to be at balance, you want to set your thermostat to 70 degrees and just stay there, but sometimes things happen, right? Like you turn your stove on, and in order to get back to 70 degrees, your air conditioning has to kick on to bring you back down, for example. Same idea happens in your body. You want to be at this level of stress, but other things happen and your body has to mobilize resources to bring you back down to that level. And sometimes you don't mobilize resources appropriately, or the stressor doesn't go away. And that's when we start to experience wear and tear on the system, which is that allostatic load. And that wear and tear is what ultimately leads to negative health outcomes. And then lastly, it's not all doom and gloom. I knew I wasn't going to have a whole lot of time here, but there's a lot of work that's going on research-wise on how work can actually have positive health impacts and outcomes for people. So looking at meaningful work, do you feel like your job is actually doing something good and doing something good for you and society? And what are the positive outcomes for that? Looking at mindfulness, mindfulness is sort of a double-edged sword right now. A lot of companies are throwing mindfulness at all of their problems when mindfulness is just a tool in a bucket, and it's taking something that can have an organizational solution and putting it on the individual and saying like, oh, if only you were more mindful, you could handle all of these stressors that I'm throwing at you. Hence the double-edged sword. But there are a lot of really cool positive benefits to mindfulness, and there's a lot of empirical research on mindfulness. And then something else that's really hot right now is looking at breaks and vacation and detaching from work, and basically finding out how you can recover and find meaning and positive health and well-being and psychological outcomes by disengaging from work, and then come back refreshed and ready to go at it the next day or the next week. If you're interested in occupational health psychology, this is just a list of some of the centers of excellence and also research training centers. So these are schools that have OHP explicit centers, though that's not to say they're the only places doing OHP research in the States. And then if you're interested, these are some of the journals. Obviously, there's SOHP. And if you're really interested, you can join the listserv where people just chat about research there. And then if you are more of a social media type person, you can follow PSYOP. So this is the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology. So again, that broader workplace psychology realm from these various places. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. K.A. Fletcher. You can go to SOHP online, as I mentioned, for the Society of Occupational Health Psychology. And then as Clemente mentioned, I have a podcast called Healthy Work. You can find on any of your podcatching software. And also a plug for my colleague's podcast, Worker Being. Same idea, also focuses on occupational health psychology, but it's more of a deeper dive, longer type podcast, whereas mine tends to be brief overviews, 8 minutes of new research. So thanks. I know I talk fast. I want to cover a lot. I get very excited, but I'm now super happy to answer any questions with the last, I guess, 10 minutes that we have.
I'll ask a question while our students think about possible questions. So one of our classes focuses on personal finance. So if you can speak a little bit about the connection of personal finance issues and occupational health psychology, that'd be great.
Oh man, Clemente, thanks for like setting me up for a nice hit right here. I've got a study going on right now about it. So we know, like, obviously work is largely how you get your finances. And so being underpaid or not having financial literacy, potentially you can get that through your employer, is a stressor and has like negative health outcomes. We know that having lower income is in of itself a stressor, and we see like a broad range of negative health outcomes of that. And then we can also turn that around and say like, hey, workplaces, here's some incentive to pay your people more. One study that I have going on right now, very preliminary, but we see that leaders or managers who experience financial stress tend to be more abusive supervisors, particularly men. We don't really see that effect for women in a couple of different samples. And so sort of like this spiral, right, where if you're underpaying your leaders, they're gonna be more abusive to their followers, who are also probably underpaid. And so now they're underpaid and being abused. And so that's also tends to be the story with financial stress and low income, is that that in of itself is a stressor, but it also brings on a lot of other stressors, which ultimately impacts negative health. Yeah.
I'll chime in again. I guess this one will be a little bit more broad.
Yeah.
Just referring in regards to psychology as a whole. Is it good to study psychology or major in it, pursue it as a career option?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think absolutely. So it's hard, admittedly, it is hard to find a job in psychology with just a psychology undergraduate degree. Largely, you're going to need to go to graduate school in some capacity if you want a job that's explicitly psychology. That's not to say that you can't use your psychology degree in the workplace. There are plenty of people doing IO psychology on the front lines with just an undergraduate degree in psychology, being specialized in IO psych. But certainly like an advanced degree helps. But also, I think everything is psychology. You know, we are social creatures, and I think at the very least it gives you the tools, both mathematical, there's a lot of statistics in psychology, and then also logical, thinking about how X leads to Y leads to Z, and interpersonal interactions, and helping reframing things, helping sell yourself to potential employers. And, you know, shameless plug for IO psychology, I think studying IO psych, you're all going to work. So even if you aren't majoring in psychology, or aren't pursuing a career in psychology or IO psychology, taking an IO psychology class gives you insight. It helps you peel back that curtain into what's going on in job applications, in job searches, in the workplace itself. And so I think it's absolutely valuable. There, you know, society's kind of done psychology a disservice by making people think that the only career path from a psych major is a career in counseling or psychology, like clinical psychology. And there are so many others. You can be a researcher, like a professor. You can be an IO psychologist working in workplaces, or advertising psychology type, like marketing psych. You can do data analysis. That's a typical career path. Is data scientists are largely psychologists because we mostly work with data, right? Large data sets. And so, yeah, I think it's definitely worth pursuing, and being open to career paths that aren't just clinical psychology if you do pursue it.
And we have one question in the chat box. How many years were you in school?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had my 4 years of undergraduate degree, and I also, just like you, had some credit transfers from high school from taking dual enrollment classes. But I wanted to take advantage of the full 4 years, and tuition was tuition regardless at my school. So I had 4 years of undergrad, and then I went straight through to a PhD program that was a co-PhD master's program. And the thing to note here is that if you're in a PhD program, they're paid for largely. You will be a teaching assistant or a research assistant, but you're not paying for that schooling. And in fact, they're paying you probably pittance, your poverty level, but it's payment. And so that's something to consider, is like, oh, I can't afford school. You might, PhDs are different. Masters, you're largely paying for them. There are plenty of scholarships out there. But I was in my PhD for 5.5 years. Yeah, because I graduated in 2018. So actually only 5 years. So I was in my PhD program for 5 years, but I was working the last year and a half. So it's only, depending on which program you go to, 2 or 3 years of classwork, and then that final portion is working on your dissertation and your comprehensive exams or whatever. So it's largely like self-paced. So some of my colleagues who started graduate school with me graduated 8 years later because they wanted to do things a little bit slower. They had full-time jobs, full families. And I think the fastest I've seen someone go through a PhD program, he was highly motivated, was 3 years. But it's doable. Whereas like my wife, for example, she started with getting her master's, which was, I believe, 2 years, and then she was in our PhD program for an additional 6 years. So that's 8 years on top of an undergrad. So it's really variable at that point, but somewhere between 4 and 6 years is the average, I think.
And just to chime in, it really depends on what it is that you want to do with your degree. So for example, I only have a master's. My background's in IO psychology as well. I didn't pursue a PhD because I had no real interest in pursuing research, or being a full-time professor and things like that. So it really depends. And the same could be said for other areas of psychology, where if you want to do therapy and counseling, you could get only a master's and be licensed as a therapist. You get a PhD, you're going to get paid more ultimately, right? The more education, more training, more specialization, the more you're going to command in the workforce. It ultimately is going to really depend on what your outcome or your overall goal is.
I see in the chat someone asked about workplace bullying, how to reduce that. There are a couple of different things to do. So first is selection. So you want to hire people who aren't going to be workplace bullies. There's sort of a personality, there are personality predictors of who's going to be a bully and engage in bullying. So you want to hire people that won't be high in those traits. You also want to have, again, sort of a safety climate, but instead of a safety climate, psychological safety. So you want to encourage create an environment where bullying is not tolerated, where people feel empowered to call each other out if they are bullying. They feel supported by the workplace to report bullying. And so there are multiple different levers. That's one of the things with most of what we're going to talk about is they're never a one and done solution. There are a range of different levers you can pull, and they vary organization to organization. But we know, I think those are some of the key ones. Someone asked, I didn't want to go to medical school. What changed my mind? And the major you switched to, was it hard at first? So what changed my mind was I realized that I wanted to have like work-life balance. And I recognize in medicine, there's, again, a wide range. You can be like family practice and have some work-life balance, or you can be trauma surgeon in the ER and have none. But like just the idea of that uncertainty, I think was too much for me. I wanted something a little bit clearer. And I was in my history and systems psychology class, my final semester or second to last semester of undergrad, learned about IO psychology, and we can study healthcare workers. And so I felt like I could still keep one foot in that domain, have that meaningful impact in that world without having that experience. And I was really fortunate. I was already a psych and neuroscience double major, so I didn't actually have to switch majors. And was it hard at first? I think so, but it was a challenge, not a threat. Let's see. As the brain process work, place and financial stressors to respond to them. Oh man, that's a really great question. So I think I'm not going to give you a direct answer because I don't think I can. But I will say that, like, for example, social pain. So being rejected activates the same brain centers to relatively the same degree as physical pain. So like being punched, other than like the somatic part of your brain, it activates the same sort of pain regions, negative affect regions. And I think you can see sort of a similar thing with workplace stressors. The same types of brain regions are going to be activated. And then add, like in your example, financial stressors, that's chronic, right? You're constantly having to be anxious and worried about where's your check going to come from? Are you going to be able to afford food this week or rent this week? And that takes up brain space. You only have so much cognitive capacity and brain space. So not only are you spending a lot of time worrying about that, which is stressful, but you're also not spending your time focusing on other things, which might be like safety behaviors. And so that is exposing you to more stressors. I wish I could give you a clear answer, but that's like a full lecture. Does stress weaken the immune system, Nelson? Yeah, absolutely. So I forget the exact type of white blood cell it is, but there is a receptor on one of your white blood cells that's particularly sensitive to stress hormones and neurotransmitters. And we know that stress basically shuts down or lowers, right? Not completely shuts down your immune response. So stress does weaken the immune system, but you can get it back. It bounces back if you remove the stressor. Who exactly do employees go to for? Oh, this is a really good question. First and foremost, like if you're exposed to workplace stressors, go to HR, right? Human resources is going to be either able to point you in the direction of like employee assistance programs, which is closer, I think, to what you're asking, which is psychological, mental counseling, if you're being exposed to stressors. But also, they might be able to point to like policies or practices that are already in place that can help reduce your exposure to the stressor. Ideally, we don't want you to just have to deal with the stressor. We want to remove the stressor. That's more effective. And so HR might be able to remove that stressor. If not, they can point you in the direction of psychological or mental counseling. Usually it's not in-house, but sometimes it is. Kind of depends on the organization and what they value and like what their resources are. But yeah, HR is first and foremost. And I'm just going to put this plug in. If you feel like you've been discriminated against for either your actual or perceived membership to a certain class, race, sex, pregnancy, age, sexual orientation at this point, gender, disability, again, bring that up to HR. But then also the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is the federal watchdog over organizations that is responsible for making sure that organizations don't engage in that discrimination. And so I know that isn't directly what you asked, but that is also another workplace stressor that's a threat, which is discrimination. And that is where you would take that ultimately if HR wasn't able to like resolve your complaints.
And I just want to quickly chime in regarding Akashi's question. So HR, usually, or the organization you work for, usually has an EAP, employee assistantship program, and those are the ones that provide some sort of mental health counseling, assistance. And then the second thing I want to make sure it's clear: IO psychologists and occupational health psychologists do not provide therapy or counseling. We focus more on the organizational factors, making sure that the work that you do is motivating, it's engaging, working with policies, creating training programs, etc. So even if an employee needs some sort of psychological help, they would be referred to a counseling or clinical psychologist. So we think of more broader kind of workplace factors, and then the counseling and clinical psychologist would work on, the therapy, the counseling, working with the individual to address, the issues or kind of come up with strategies.
Oh no, I think you might be muted.
I am. Thank you about that. I think that's a common thing now with the Zooms, like you're muted or I can't hear you.
Yeah.
So any other questions, comments? If not, I'll be sending out the recording later today to everyone, so you can have that, and it'll get posted on the College Now YouTube channel by tomorrow, the latest. Doesn't seem like we have any more questions. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Fletcher. We greatly appreciate it. We appreciate your insight on this topic, and hopefully all of you, got something out of it, whether it's, thinking of this as a possible career option, or just something you may want to explore in regards to your study and seeing how that connects to the courses you're already taking, whether it's critical health issues, personal finance, business fundamentals, psychology, etc. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Take care and have a great day.